Hi everybody, and welcome back to Larry Chung's Master Academy series on mental performance. This is video 8, and it's going to be focused on focus, right? Keeping your eyes on the prize, how to stay focused when you're on the course, when you're practicing, what are the different areas of focus, different ways of focusing, and how you can overcome distractions when you're playing. So what exactly is focus, right? So focus is something that use all of our senses. Even as we're watching this video, you're using your eyes and your ears to watch and listen to everything that I'm saying. And what we don't realize is we like to use the imagery of a funnel, right? All the time we're getting lots of stimuli from everywhere, but we tend to only focus on what we deem as important, right? So right now you're probably not paying attention to the way that the chair feels on your back or anything like that. You're just paying attention to what you're seeing and what you're hearing. So focusing is a skill. It's, again, like all the other mental skills, it's something we develop. We can decide to use all our senses at the same time or only focus on one or two. We can focus on a wide range of things. We can make that funnel a little bit bigger, or we can make that funnel a little bit smaller. And the ability to do that is what the mental skill of focusing is all about. So think back to the last time you were very much in the zone, right? Think of that intense focus that you were engaged in. How did you get into that focus, and what kind of focus was it, right? What were you actually paying attention to? So what we like to say is this is a very unique experience to a lot of individuals. Not everybody experiences the zone and focus in the zone the same way, but most of the time we talk about a very intense directed focus, right? It's very easy to pay attention to the things we need to when we're in the zone, and very easy to ignore the things that would maybe normally distract us. So this is just kind of like a simple self-awareness exercise. Think back to the last time you were playing extremely well, and did you have a very broad sense of focus or a very narrow sense of focus? And how easy was it for you to be able to overcome things like distractions? So again, focusing as a skill, it's the ability to not just direct our attention at something, but to maintain it, right? Focus is very difficult to maintain sometimes, as I'm sure all of you know of, whether sometimes it's difficult to focus at work or at school. And people often take focus for granted, right? Assuming it's something that you either have in that moment or not. But what we don't realize is the best people who are very skilled at the art of focusing can kind of work their way up and focus even when it's difficult to not pay attention to things, even when it's difficult to not pay attention to things, and still perform well when things are trying to distract them, right? So again, it's the ability to direct and maintain focus that makes focusing a skill. And just because your processing power is quite limited all the time, the better you get at focusing, the better you get the skill of focusing, you can pay attention to more things at once, or pay attention to one thing much more intensely. So we like to say that there are 4 different types of focus, and they're very easily represented in golf. So going through, there are 2 different factors that kind of create this matrix, right? We can have a very broad focus or a very narrow focus. And at the same time, we can have a very internal focus or more external focus. So these kind of crisscross to create 4 different areas of focus. And the first one being a broad and internal focus. We call this the kind of analysis type of focus. And this is used to kind of create a strategy, right? So think of the first time you step up onto a hole, you see what kind of par it is, where the trouble is, how far, you immediately come up with a plan on how you're going to play that hole, right? So it's that coming up with a game plan, coming up with a strategy, comes from a more broad and internal focus. You're considering your own skills against what you're seeing. And then next, we have broad and external focus, right? We have what we call kind of the assessment kinds of focus. So as you're stepping into the actual shot, you're calculating the yardage, the wind, whether it's hot, cold, how far you're going to have to hit it. You pay attention to the things that are more around you, right? In a very broad sense. So we call this kind of the assessment kind of focus. As we move internally, we have a very narrow and internal focus, which we use kind of for preparation. So for example, this is when you repeat swing thoughts to yourself, you repeat your mantra to yourself, you give yourself that little pep talk as you step up to go hit the ball, when you're paying attention to the things that you are saying to yourself. So this kind of ties in with the self-talk module that we talked about. And then lastly, we have what we call a very narrow and external kind of focus. And this is what we actually tend to use when we actually try to execute skills. We call this the acting kind of focus. So golf very easily represents all these kinds of focus in at different times. being able to manipulate these four kinds of focus, hop in and out of these different kinds of focus is what makes focusing a skill so important in golf. So the idea is everybody here has a preferred focusing style, right? So when the pressure is on, when the pressure is high, we tend to focus on one of these four areas. So think back to, again, to your last high pressured event. Think back to whether you were a little bit more internal, thinking about the things you were saying to yourself, or maybe you were a little bit more external, paying attention to the people or players around you. If you're more kind of internal or external, certain things can go right or go wrong depending on what your preferred focusing style is. So that is why the idea of somebody who is very skilled at the skill of focusing will be able to hop in and out of internal, external, broad, and narrow kinds of focuses very easily, and they don't get bogged down by their preferred focusing style. But it's just important to note that everybody does have one, and it's important to figure out what yours is. So because most of the times when distractions come up, distractions will target your preferred focusing style. If you're very kind of narrow internal kinds of focus, mostly distractions might come in the form of negative self-talk or negative thoughts, right? At the same time, if you tend to be a more broad and external kind of person, distractions might come in the form of the crowd, other people, the performance of other people around you. So paying attention to what your own preferred focusing style is reveals a lot about how you can manage your focus in the future. So how do we use focus effectively in golf, right? Again, because your preferred focusing style is what you tend to fall back on, we have to recognize whatever situation we're in and how we can sort of move from one style of focus to another. And this might sometimes mean using a style of focus that is not quite as developed or something we're not quite as comfortable with using all the time. So how can we sort of practice these kinds of focus? So we're just kind of go through each one and just a couple of quick tips and ideas of how we can practice things like your broad and internal focus, right? Because your broad and internal focus, kind of pays attention to what you're thinking to yourself. And coming up with that game plan of how you're going to play the hole, right? So this is more about planning, strategy, analysis, and sometimes more about long-term improvements as well. So we can develop this area of focus by using things like creativity and logic to solve problems, right? Doing things like brain teasers, crosswords, problem-solving games will help develop this broad and internal area of focus. Because this is a more broad and internal general area of how we're feeling, sometimes trying to mentally practice skills from a first-person point of view. So if you're just not able to get out to the course for whatever reason, or not able to get out to the range for that practice, being able to have the ability to sit there and vividly imagine yourself going through swings and going through drills is a great way to practice your broad and internal source of focus. And then the last thing we have is trying to be able to flow through thoughts as easily as possible, right? So how often are we paying attention to the things that we're thinking about? And this is an exercise in self-awareness as well, but just take 5 minutes out of your day, let your mind wander to whatever it wants to wander to, and then after those 5 minutes, try to see if you can accurately remember everything you thought about or said to yourself. Next we have broad and external types of focus. Again, very important in golf because, again, no golf course is ever going to be the same. No golf shot is ever going to be the same. You're constantly going to have to take stimuli and cues from the wind, the air, the distance, the course, the grass even, about the type of shots that you're going to want to hit. So practicing the broad and external focus means testing your ability to more see the big picture, right? Take in as much stimuli as you possibly can. A very helpful exercise is to, people watch while traveling, for example. Notice patterns as you're golfing, right? Notice how shots often react when you're practicing in a certain wind. Notice how shots react when you're hitting from certain lies. Being able to pick up on these patterns is the pinnacle of having a very good broad and external source of style of focus. And next we have a narrow and internal source of focus, right? So we've talked a lot about the narrow internal source of focus before when we talked about breathing and being able to manage your activation. This is the easiest way of practicing narrow internal focuses because it's something that you can actually learn how to manipulate in yourself. So if you recall from activation video, a really great way to focus on yourself is to pay attention to your breathing and try to manipulate your breathing and your heart rate at the same time, right? So if you recall, breathing in often increases your heart rate, breathing out will often decrease it. trying to be able to manipulate that as often as possible to match up with how you would actually want to feel when you're on the golf course is really important. This is why so many golfers in their pre-shot routines will incorporate some sort of breathing to put themselves into a state of mind or a state of a physical state that they feel comfortable executing their shot in. And then lastly, we have the external and narrow focus, right? Pretty much the most important focus for actually executing any athletic movement, and especially so in golf, right? So external and narrow focuses are important in execution of skills. They're very powerful, and we can kind of develop these by using cues and tokens, right? So in golf, it's very easy to have what we call a refocusing token. So I ask a lot of the athletes I work with to choose a very small object, whatever it is, and really pay attention to every little piece and corner of it so that they're able to pick it out with their eyes closed from a bunch of other similar things if they needed to. This practice of being able to pick up on little small details is important in having an external and narrow focus. On the golf course, it's a really great, or actually on the range, it's a really great idea to kind of use an external, what I call an external targets exercise. And a really great way we can develop our external and narrow focus on the range is to pick a point or something interesting that's far on the distance, stare at it, really memorize what it looks like, and then close your eyes and see how long you can hold that picture in your head for. It usually fades away kind of quickly if you're not very good at this. People, as you get better and better, as you pick more vivid objects, as you're able to create a more vivid imagery for yourself, you'll be able to visualize that object as exactly as it is for longer and longer periods of time. And this is important because often in golf, our targets, what we're actually trying to hit to, what we're trying to be external to, isn't something that we're actually looking at throughout the golf swing, right? We're usually looking at the ball, which you could count as a target, but really the target is, I don't know, either the fairway or the hole or the green, whatever that is. So being able to vividly imagine that in your head the whole time is a really great practice for developing your external and narrow type of focus. So how can we deal with things like distractions? Like what are distractions? So we like to say that distractions, if you think back to the funnel imagery again, is when that funnel gets a little bit too wide and stimuli that we don't necessarily want to pay attention to is actually getting through, right? So if somebody is playing, you know, music as you're watching this video, that can be very distracting, and it might be difficult for you to concentrate on exactly the things that I'm saying, right? So, but we like to say like distractions can, you know, target all areas of focus. They can be both internal and external, but the idea is to either reframe them, block them, or replace them, right? So we're going to kind of see how we can do that with the 3 techniques upcoming. The first one is what we call a quiet eye technique, and this is kind of present throughout all sports. Any sport with that narrow and external focus, if you look at the really high performing athletes and individuals, you are going to notice that at the moment of executing their actions, their eyes are very still on their target, right? You see very little movement. A really great study was done with people who are either good putters or bad putters. The good putters tended to really stare at one point on the ball the whole time, whereas the bad putters, their eyes were wandering all over the place, right? So the more still that you can keep your eyes, the more likely it is that you're going to execute a better movement. The reasoning, there's lots of reasons that are behind that, but it kind of doubles in the sports psychology world because it really makes your focus as much as you can a narrow and external focus, right? It really tightens up that funnel that stimuli can get through. And the more you're able to focus, use one style of focus, right? Again, we said that your focus is very limited. So if you're using one style of focus a lot and very intensely, it's difficult for other distractions to come in, right? For example, things like broad and external types of distractions like noises and sounds won't get through as much if you're very focused intently with your eyes. Things like internal thoughts and and self-talk isn't going to come up quite as often because you're very intensely focused on something narrow and outside of you and external from you. Creating that routine, right? So very often golfers will talk about being able to walk through the routine as often as possible, the importance of a routine. So why exactly is a routine so important? And it's because it's a cue for you to focus on the appropriate stimuli at the right time. What we like to say is a good routine will walk you through all four types of focus before you hit a golf shot, right? So before you step up to the ball, you're going to broadly, internally analyze your tactics for this hole. You're going to broadly, externally, analyze the wind, the yardage, the grass, and then you're also going to internally think about a swing cue or a swing thought that's been working for you. And as you step up behind the ball, again, with that very narrow and external quiet eye focus, right before you start to execute your shot, right? So a good routine walks you through, it hits all 4 types of focus, walks you through all 4 types, and hopefully sets you up to hit as good of a shot as you can. So it's important for a routine to hit all 4 points. It's important for you to keep this routine consistent, even when you're practicing, and especially when you're playing. And then lastly, the last way we can usually deal with more distractions that are usually a little bit more internal. A lot of people obviously have this idea that negative self-talk or not having low confidence is going to negatively affect your shot. And very often they kind of force themselves to ignore what's going on or what they're saying to themselves, right? So the idea is if you ever have to force yourself to focus instead of just letting it happen, you're actually putting a little bit more strain on yourself than you need to. The idea here is that even negative thoughts or negative thoughts before a golf shot don't necessarily have to result in a poor result, right? I'm sure a lot of people have had a negative thought before hitting a golf shot before and have still executed fine. The reverse might also be true, but the idea is that there doesn't necessarily have to be this correlation. So we go into this idea of accepting your own thoughts and feelings and letting thoughts and feelings flow through you, right? So having that, even though you have that narrow and internal source of focus, maybe it's best to try to move from a narrow and internal source of focus to a little bit more broad, right? So shifting from narrow to broad, so letting as many thoughts flow through you as possible. That way, sometimes good thoughts flow through you, sometimes negative thoughts flow through, but at the end of the day, they don't necessarily have to, it's the understanding that they don't necessarily have to affect the outcome, right? So instead you want to accept internal distractions and thoughts as just part of the natural course of playing golf. They don't have to be something that you have to necessarily fight over. At these times, it's best to actually just maybe shift your focus to something a little bit more narrow and external. So, right, just understand that you had that thought, but let's actually focus on the ball, focus on the hole right now. So, just kind of as a summary, again, focusing is a skill that you would really want to develop. The more you practice focus, the more things you'll be able to focus on, and the more intensely you'll be able to focus on individual things. Everyone has a preferred focusing style. Figure out what yours is so that you can properly manage yourself when you get into a situation where maybe your focusing style isn't going to be the most useful, right? The idea here is then you have to shift to a better preferred, a more useful focusing style. And the only way to do that is to be aware of what style you are using at all times. When you're executing movements, it's always better to try to have a narrow and external focus, right? Remember that quiet eye routine. The more still you can have your eyes on the target, the more intensely focused you are externally, the harder it is for distractions for it to break through. Keep as consistent a routine as you can and build a routine that targets all 4 types of focus or allows you to at least walk through all 4 types of focus because they're all important in executing a great golf shot. And then lastly, let your thoughts flow as much as possible. Recognize that negative thoughts happen. They don't necessarily determine the result of your shot. Just accept that it happened, move on, and try again to move on to a more external and narrow focus, right? And keep that quiet eye. So we want to keep a quiet eye as we're executing because that lets us execute with more of a quiet mind as well. So that's the end of the video. Hopefully we'll see you in the next one.